Now, I realize that the title of this video might come off as a little bit strange, considering, well, One Piece is a still ongoing fictional world created in Japan basically 3 decades ago at this point. Meanwhile, Aristotle was a guy who lived in the 4th century BC within Greece. In our reality, especially so because you could maybe lump in much of classical antiquity and medieval Europe in this link I'm going to draw. Furthermore, this entire video becomes even weirder when you factor in that I haven't really even consumed much of the media property of One Piece. From all of that, I understand that you might not have the highest expectations that this video will ever at all be coherent, but just trust me, this video is going to go somewhere. That's not even a promise that it will become coherent, I'm just saying that it's going to go somewhere. Having said those introductory statements, I suppose the first thing that is in need of being addressed is what even is One Piece, as I assume some people just won't be familiar. And second, the obvious fact that this is technically a video about said fictional series from a guy that, by my own words, kind of just admitted to having never really watched or read much of it. Regarding that first point, although this video in particular is more about the geography than anything else, I feel like I should give at least some brief synopsis. So, to define the series as neutrally as possible, I would say that it is a story created by Ichiro Oda about this guy, assembling a crew of friends he meets and sailing out into the world as pirates, not in the way of plundering or violating innocent people, but more so that they exist outside or in direct opposition to the ruling government, which holds an authoritarian and seemingly malevolent control over the entire planet. Although each individual member has their own ultimate goal, the desire of our protagonist is to track down and obtain the treasure, or One Piece, of this guy, who before the start of the series was the most successful pirate in known history to that point. And I'll stop there. You could go much more into detail about the plot, characters, themes, and so on, but a basic introduction will suffice. Regarding that second point, it might already sound like I am at least familiar enough with the series to have watched or read some of it, and yeah, that's technically true, but the technically there is to enough of a degree that I wasn't really sure what I should say. So to elaborate on that, a few years ago after anime really became like mainstream in American culture, I got really sick for like a little over a week, and while I was sick, I ended up binge watching a few of the opening arcs of the show, and then never touched it again. If that was about nearly any other show, I would say that equates to having watched it, but since this series is so absurdly long, to the point that even after having watched a few of the beginning arcs, it totals to only having watched like a few percent of the show, maybe. It felt improper to say that I've officially watched it. Unofficially though, I've watched it, I guess. Will I ever pick it up again? For a lot of reasons, almost certainly not. But the one that matters for our conversation is that simply by just existing on the internet, I've passively become overfamiliar with the world to the point that I already know both a lot of the plot up to this point in time, and for our purposes, the setting, specifically the geography. The One Piece story is set in a pretty interesting location, humbly called the Blue Planet, because it's blue. I mean, our planet is pretty blue too, but this one is considerably more blue. It appears that a lot of people have really tried to get into the specifics on some of the world building, but it's an intentionally cartoonish series, so I think a lot of that is kind of misguided, but still, in spite of that, there are always going to be some things that remain consistent. Aside from it mostly being water with varyingly large islands being dotted around, there are two quite dominating geographic features. To give you your vocab word of the day, both are orthodromes, or the largest circle that can be drawn onto a sphere, which always results in it being divided into 2 hemispheres. Mathematicians may have a more technical way of defining it, but I think that is good enough for a random YouTube video. If you took a look at our globe, you'd probably recognize at least 2 of them. The equator, and if you combine them together, the prime meridian and antimeridian. Looking back at the One Piece world, their 2 orthodromes, which are perpendicular to each other, play a much bigger part in the life of their planet. First, what is called the Red Line, the planet's only real continent, which basically acts as an enormous wall coming up from the bottom of the sea and ascending to a practically insurmountable height, effectively splitting the planet in 2. It is composed of a red and tough material, and outside of one exception seems to host basically no life or civilization at all, only being a barrier to humanity. Second, what is called the Grand Line, a more oceanic phenomenon. It is a belt of water going around the entire planet, unique in its unpredictable and inhospitable conditions, anarchy, and mystery, which is furthermore surrounded on both sides by barriers called calm belts, areas of no wind or current, an intimidating prospect in and of itself when many still travel by sail, which are on top of that the breeding grounds for the world's enormous sea monsters. Although not technically a physical obstruction, the Grand Line is just as much a barrier to humanity in both its inaccessibility and inherent danger. You may be tempted to imagine the Grand Line as on the equator and the red line corresponding to our meridian and anti-meridian, but technically the two respectively exist on a northwest to southeast axis and northeast to southwest axis, hence why the four regions that it necessarily divides the world up into are called the North Blue, the South Blue, the East Blue, and the West Blue. There are plenty of other things sort of related to this, stuff like what's going on below the sea and above into the clouds, its north and south poles, reverse mountain, how magnetism functions, climates, seasons, how that might have changed over time, and so on. But I'm assuming that I'm reaching the point in my prologue where many people would be willing to click off if I don't get around to explaining how this fictional planet, with two world-defining and inhospitable barriers that work together to divide this place and its people into four distinct sections, has anything to do with Aristotle. And, well, I suppose it is indeed about time that I began delivering on my promises, as my claim for this video is that there was indeed a barrier, long forgotten in our cultural consciousness, that was once theorized about by Aristotle and his intellectual descendants, which bisected the world, and even that it is far more intimidating than the Grand Line or Red Line could ever hope to be. To cut off what I hope sounded like at least a somewhat intriguing delivery there, I know that that is only one orthodrome and One Piece has two, and while I will actually attempt to give what is at least a line, I guess, I'll just go ahead and warn you that it won't be as cool. Or, I guess it's sorta cool, we get to talk about Atlantis, but it is something, I guess. Okay, let's start. I actually think the best place to begin this is with a little geography lesson about our own planet, since, well, Aristotle lived on it. So whatever he said about it that made my brain instantly think to One Piece had its origins in a lot of the same geographic concepts that persist on our maps to this day. So, having said that, as a kid, did you ever look closely at like a world map kind of like this? The stereotypical sort of one that would be in like your history teacher's classroom or something? Well, one of the things that I always noticed but never really cared enough to look into were some of these lines of latitude. Specifically, and going from south to north, are the Antarctic Circle, the Tropic of Capricorn, the Equator, the Tropic of Cancer, and the Arctic Circle. Growing up, I always found these kind of like a little strange or arbitrary. I mean, aside from the equator, which seems pretty intuitive, why would we bother, for example, giving the latitudinal line of 23 degrees, 26 minutes, and 22 seconds north a name instead of like just 25 degrees north? Turns out there are pretty intuitive reasons for all of their demarcations, which is why even to this day they are used to separate the outermost polar zones, a tropical equatorial zone, and two temperate zones sandwiched in between them. Now, for another question. How far back in history do you think this method of dividing the world dates back to? This video is literally framed about Aristotle, so I imagine literally all of you guessed him. And you'd technically be right, although not fully. The earliest preserved writings that divide up the world in this way do indeed come from him, specifically in his Meteorologica, which is estimated as having been written around like 340 BC, I think, although the idea almost certainly predates him. The originator I find pointed to most often is Parmenides, with other possible contenders being Eudoxus, Pythagoras, his followers, or the even older Thales. Overall, it seems like a pretty debated question. Regardless of where it actually comes from, these traditional divisions, which originated so long ago, can be tracked through antiquity, across the medieval period, during the modern period, up until it evolved into the more advanced climatological maps that we use today. What I left out there, though, is that for much of that timeline, there was a rather deadly component inherent to it. On this matter, I'll begin by letting Aristotle speak for himself, in his Meteorologica, Book 2, Chapter 5. Quote, "There are two inhabitable sections of the earth, one near our upper, or northern pole, the other near the other, or southern pole, and their shape is like that of a tambourine. These sections alone are habitable. Beyond the tropics no one can live, for there the shade would not fall to the north, whereas the earth is known to be uninhabitable before the sun is in its zenith, or the shade is thrown to the south, and the regions below the bear are uninhabitable because of the cold." End quote. To be honest, letting him speak for himself there might have not really helped that much, so I'll try to explain it more in a plainer modern language. Essentially, he's just trying to describe the North Temperate Zone and the Southern Temperate Zone as fit for life and habitation. The two polar regions, commonly given by later authors the label of frigid, Aristotle calls uninhabitable due to the cold. Sure, you could technically say that people have been able to live within one of them for many thousands of years, but I don't expect many people to criticize his general sentiment. This equatorial zone, however, he also describes as unlivable. The word that would often come to be used for this is torrid, which describes a heat so intense as to scorch or parch something. This, I imagine, in contrast to the idyllic language we tend to give tropical locations today, sounds rather unfamiliar to you. This torrid zone is the idea that a lot of this video is founded upon, and I really can't even do that much else to describe what it actually is. Aristotle really just seems to believe that there was this unlivable hot ring around the equator that divides the world into two habitable zones. This, in whatever weird comparison I'm trying to draw for this video, would be the equivalent of, like, the Grand Line for our world. I'm not actually totally sure who I first heard this theory attributed to, but you know what? There are a mind-boggling amount of options. The most insane part of this video to me is that this idea of a torrid zone or any adjacent concepts were just mainstream intellectual assumptions for nearly 2,000 years after Aristotle, and I've only ever heard of this in like one single obscure theological discussion I listened to a while ago. The craziest part of this video to me is not that I am attempting to compare the geography of an ancient Greek philosopher to a current-day Japanese manga artist, but that this world-altering idea of the Earth effectively being split in twain just existed for so long and was believed by so many people, and to this day, I have found like a few Reddit posts talking about it. I really wish I could stress just how believed or built into the world this appears to have been at one point. I have a companion document in the description listing a lot of the sources for many of the great minds of the Middle Ages and Antiquity, and so many of them spoke of it or included it within their worldview. It was popular enough to where there was variation within the beliefs, and that when people were willing to dispute the opinion, they really had to prove themselves. To be honest, it felt so common that I started to actually wonder if this was like just a superstition or a half-belief. But no, they really just seem to have believed it. It seems to have just kind of been a normal opinion, and to be honest, from a European or Mediterranean perspective, it really does kind of make sense when you think about it. Depending on where you live, it might already be pretty hot, but you don't have to go too south into like Africa for things to get so hot and dry to the point where you start questioning if anything can actually live there at a certain point. It isn't that big of a stretch to ponder that, like, what would happen if you went even further south? Because the equator is still a pretty good distance away. Could you, or anything for the matter, plant or animal, survive at a certain point? Obviously wrong now, but in fairness, it can actually kind of be made to make a certain amount of sense. This discussion went in like so many weird or interesting ways. Stuff like, to what extent does this torrid zone reach? Is it narrow or is it wide? Aristotle seemed to have taken a wider perspective. Even if this torrid zone is too hot to live, could you at least cross it maybe? Is this torrid zone even real? That debate really increased as the end of the Middle Ages began to near. Are there landmasses that go across the equator? Are there landmasses in the southern hemisphere? And foremost of all, if so, are those southern landmasses inhabited by people? That final question became especially important after the rise of Christianity, and many theologians either considered the idea of antipodal people, called Antipodeans, to either conflict with the theological concepts of a united and fallen humanity, and or their common savior in Jesus Christ. Being a Catholic who very much enjoys his dumb theology discussions, I'm pretty sure this is how I first heard about this topic of the Torrid Zone. These Antipodeans, as they've been called, might be my favorite part of the video. Originally, this video was actually sort of supposed to be about them, but I've chosen to postpone that kind of indefinitely, not because it isn't interesting, but it's a very complicated topic, with a lot of change and variation depending on the times, and I'm kind of just not ready to make that video at this point. I mean, these hypothetical people were basically the ancient and medieval equivalent of how, like, modern people see the idea of aliens, and just think about the range of opinions that people have about that today. There are a lot of really funny and interesting opinions and stories that come out of this, and you can find many of them listed in that companion document that I have in the description, so I encourage you to read there if you're curious. Maybe it'll make sense to try and hopefully do this in a few years or something if that Europa mission ever becomes relevant again. Going back to Aristotle though, aside from believing that this Torrid Zone basically bisected the world into two hemispheres, what did he believe about the idea of antipodal continents and their potential inhabitants? The One Piece world, aside from I think most of the Red Line, is inhabited throughout the entire planet, to my knowledge, so this comparison I'm drawing would be kinda weird if Aristotle thought only his section of the world could be inhabited. On the idea of antipodal landmasses, he is in the affirmative camp. In fact, he basically pioneers the entire concept. Take our word Antarctica, coming from the Greek Antarcticos. It, to my knowledge, has its first appearance in Aristotle's Meteorologica. Terra Australis, where we get the word Australia from, is the concept's Latin equivalent. The idea of a hypothetical southern continent was kinda just a thing until its discovery, although towards the end there was more so out of reverence for tradition than any intellectual principles. For a long time though, its existence did have supporting ideas regardless of their legitimacy or illegitimacy. Aristotle, in his work On the Heavens, Book 2, Chapter 14, articulates on the basis of a motionless and geocentric Earth, an implication that Earth's continents must balance each other out. To try and summarize his belief, essentially, if there is this big landmass that his known world inhabits, then there must be an equivalently massive one antipodally to where his is located, otherwise the Earth would become unbalanced and enter a state of motion. Looking back to the same book and chapter from his Meteorologica, he communicates the idea again in a further passage. Quote, "Now since there must be a region bearing the same relation to the southern pole as the place we live in bears to our pole, it will clearly correspond in the ordering of its winds as well as in other things." End quote. Of this region that, according to him, must exist on the opposite end of the Earth, would those other things that it has correspondence with also include people? Aristotle doesn't say anything here, but looking back at his On the Heavens, Book 2, Chapter 2, and in a passage where he's debating whether north or south should be seen as up under his worldview, he says this, quote, "Clearly therefore the invisible or southern pole is the upper, and those who live in the region of it are in the upper hemisphere and to the right, whereas we are in the lower and to the left." End quote. I know people nowadays get kind of annoyed when you give the northern hemisphere the label of upper, both for social and scientific reasons, but it is actually really interesting to hear someone from so long ago propose the reverse concept. If you're curious, his justification has to do with the way the stars appear to rotate, one that he would further complicate with his following sentence. Aside from that, and actually going back to our relevant topic, the point that I kind of just skipped over there is the seeming assumption that there are indeed those who live in the southern hemisphere. There isn't really much I can say beyond that. So, to give a recap, so far, according to Aristotle, there are humans living on landmasses in both the northern and southern hemispheres, and they should be separated by a scorchingly hot belt stretching across the whole of the equator. Aside from the fact that One Piece is largely a world of archipelagos, and Aristotle's Earth seems to be composed of actual continents, this is an issue I will acknowledge later, we seem to be well on our way towards making the actual live-action adaptation of One Piece. Having made all of those points, we can now get around to the part of the video that will, without a doubt, at least be interesting. Because, to make very clear a point that I've tried to imply in passing, this video is incredibly stupid. Like, genuinely, this is a truly awful video idea. My brain heard one mildly interesting historical geography fact, for who knows what reason, instinctively compared it to a children's cartoon, and massively overcommitted to that idea, way more than anyone should ever do for anything. In spite of that, I, like any good captain, will see my voyage through to its end. So, how well did I do at justifying a conclusion that I already wanted to reach? Let's go ahead and take a look. My claim for this part largely rests upon Aristotle's complicated and at times potentially contradictory thoughts on the Atlantic Ocean, what he generally refers to as the seas beyond the Pillars of Heracles. It doesn't take a historian to know that said waters, for much of antiquity, had a rather ominous reputation, especially for the Greeks. As a starting point, let's take a gander at a rather mundane statement from Aristotle, coming again in his Meteorologica, Book 2, Chapter 5, and extrapolate some beginning concepts from them. Quote, "There is nothing to prevent our traveling around the earth unless the extent of the sea presents an obstacle anywhere." End quote. A few sentences later, he also says this line, quote, "And it is the sea which divides, as it seems, the parts beyond India from those beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and prevents the earth from being inhabited all around." End quote. From this, Aristotle appears to think of the Atlantic Ocean as a thing separating his end of the North Habitable Zone from what is, from his perspective, the further end of the habitable zone. And don't worry, my argument here isn't just going to be that the Atlantic Ocean is a second barrier. To be honest, at this point I wish my argument was that simple. Either way, two things to take notice of here. First is his language of unless. That indicates to me that here he isn't actually sure how far away the Pillars of Heracles are from the easternmost parts of Asia. They could be close, they could be far, but what I do think one could assert here is that the language he gives very much paints a picture that the only thing potentially acting as a barrier is that distance of the ocean. If things stop there, I'd kinda have to give up on coming up with some equivalent to the red line. But there is surprisingly more that I can kinda shove into this conversation. Take this small comment he made just a bit earlier in his Meteorologica, still in Book 2, but this time in Chapter 5. Quote, "Outside the Pillars of Heracles, the sea is shallow, owing to the mud, but calm, for it lies in a hollow." End quote. There are three elements from Aristotle's comment that we need to analyze here. I'm going to go in order of the water's reported shallowness, its calmness, and this mention of the mud. The former two, the shallowness and calmness, might not sound particularly threatening to us. Aristotle himself doesn't actually give it more than a sentence, but that was a big deal back then. If your ship didn't have the necessary water beneath it, every little bit further you went could have been a gamble on if you tear your hull open, hit a stray rock, or cause some other form of damage. Stagnant wind could be even worse. Best case scenario, it might prevent you from entering into an area. Worst case scenario, it might leave you stranded in the middle of the ocean with nothing to do but row. There is a reason even One Piece, despite having endless possibilities in a world of cartoonish powers, still use that as part of a barrier in its world building. Furthermore, Aristotle, in attributing these dangers to the Atlantic Ocean, can be reasonably assumed to have been the victim of Carthaginian propaganda. There isn't much we can actually say on the specifics of that, as very little from Carthage got preserved. But the best source in my opinion comes from Avennius, in his Ora Maritima. It comes a good while later, probably in like the 4th century AD, but he seems to have been drawing on texts and traditions that predate him to some extent, and I'm hoping that it at least somewhat represents the stories and tales that Aristotle would have been subjected to. His select passages do show some resemblance to Aristotle's mention. He tells of the water's calmness and shallowness, albeit he leans into the supposed danger a significant amount, but he mentions other things too, thick patches of seaweed, foggy and misty weather, both of which make any potential voyages even less desirable, and furthermore he also mentions sea monsters. We can tell from what has been presented so far that Aristotle did very likely inherit some of the Carthaginian fear-mongering about the Atlantic. at least to the point that he was fine assuming their stories on at least the water's calm and shallow qualities. And to be a bit more speculative, I wouldn't be surprised if he might have taken on the other elements like the seaweed, the fog, or even the sea monsters to some degree. With that said, however, Aristotle was the kind of man that was able to know of sea animals like whales or squids, both of which I'm sure he heard many fantastic tales about, and endeavored to describe them just like any other animal. There just isn't any direct evidence implicating his thoughts on stuff like the seaweed, the sea monsters, or the fogginess. So I'll just say that if he were to have believed in any of those things, it would definitely help in the argument that I'm building towards, but it doesn't rest on that. It could very well be possible that he believed in those things, but just as equally he could have not believed in them. Another thing to put alongside that strain of thought is that his native Greek background could have also been an influence on him mischaracterizing the waters beyond the Pillars of Heracles as uniquely threatening. Many of the foundational works that he probably grew up hearing, stuff like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Theogony, and other works of Greek poetry, gave the waters beyond the Mediterranean an edge-of-the-world aesthetic. It was a setting of legends, a place where things got weird, monsters could be found, and survival was nowhere guaranteed. To measure that as well too, though, Aristotle was also just as much the kind of person to be skeptical of that. Overall, on just what exactly he thought the waters beyond the Mediterranean were like, in contrast to his comments here that just seemed to imply that distance was the only inhibitor, I still think he just would have been weary of them if he actually got near them. Maybe not in the sense that they were gonna immediately kill him or something, but rather that some combinations of factors might have just made it impractical to sail out there. Hey dude, didn't you say earlier that there was more to this than the Atlantic being a barrier? Yeah, I'm getting to that. So, remember that very tiny reference to the seas beyond the Pillars of Heracles having a mud? So, we have to talk about Atlantis now. Plato, Aristotle's teacher, describes the fall of Atlantis in two places, his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias. Both of the relevant passages are small and essentially the same. I'll read you the excerpt from Critias. Quote, Atlantis, as you will recollect, was once, we said, an island larger than Libya and Asia together. It has now been engulfed by earthquakes, and is the source of the impassable mud, which prevents navigators from this quarter from advancing through the straits into the open ocean. End quote. It has long been debated as to how seriously Aristotle took the story of Plato's Atlantis. I have no care to weigh in on that or anything about Atlantis as a whole, but it does at least seem to me that he adopted this part of what his teacher said into his worldview. Aristotle doesn't describe the mud as a hindrance. He doesn't really say anything about it at all, but I think it would be quite strange for him to have taken Plato seriously on the existence of the mud enough to write it down, yet deny said mud the attributes his teacher describes it with. My point here is that if Eiichiro Oda's One Piece has the red line, then Aristotle's Earth has the mud line. This video is so stupid. The extent to which this mud line I've concocted may have reached, I'll get to that shortly. The last point I want to touch on before I get around to trying to tie everything together is the question of his estimation on the distance between the Pillars of Heracles and the easternmost extents of India. Basically just how large did he think the Atlantic Ocean was? From his two smaller statements earlier, he really does seem to have viewed the ocean's vastness itself as a potential barrier, which is another element that he might have taken from his own native Greek background, or from Carthaginian influence. But I think his statements are ambiguous enough to where he gives no official statement. Furthermore, there is also another complicated dimension to all of it as well, as further in Aristotle's On the Heavens, Book 2, Chapter 14, in the context of a passage about the size of the earth, he delivers to us a rather interesting passage. Quote, certain stars are seen in Egypt and the neighborhood of Cyprus, which are invisible in more northerly lands, and stars which are continuously visible in the northern countries are observed to set in the others. This proves both that the Earth is spherical and that its periphery is not large, for otherwise such a small change of position could not have had such an immediate effect. for this reason those who imagine that the region around the Pillars of Heracles joins on to the regions of India, and that in this way the ocean is one, are not, it would seem, suggesting anything utterly incredible. They produce also in support of their contention the fact that elephants are a species found at the extremities of both lands, arguing that this phenomenon, at the extremes, is due to communication between the two. End quote. Here, Aristotle entertains a rather striking view that the western extents of Europe or Africa could be connected to the eastern extents of India or Greater Asia. While he himself doesn't seem to have taken this position, he does acknowledge the astronomical and biological evidence that were used by other thinkers to formulate that opinion. I think his statement implying that said opinion is, in some sense at least reasonable, is key here, especially when you consider that the evidence about the stars, he uses that for his own purposes. From this, I do think it is possible that he may have thought that the seas beyond the Pillars of Heracles reach the eastern world without too much water to cross in the way. Although, like everything else, when I'm trying so hard to strain so much out of so little data, there isn't much I can say for certain. Even with this, he could just have as likely seen the Atlantic as a great ocean too far to be crossed. Which one I prefer in this stupid comparison I'm trying to make, I'll also discuss that again shortly. Now, after having gone through all of that nonsense, I'll give what I think are the best and worst case scenarios for me and whatever I'm trying to do at this point. To start, in both of them, we can actually take Aristotle's vision of our planet and assume that this unpassable Torrid Zone has a proper place. As simple as it is to say that, I don't want to treat that like it's nothing. The fact that Aristotle and so many great thinkers after him, and probably before him, actually thought that this was a thing is really cool, and that alone was actually enough to motivate me enough to want to make a whole video out of how much it feels like it fits into some fantasy world. And we also know that, like our world of One Piece, he thought that there had to be some equivalent land on the hemisphere opposite to him, and furthermore that he seems to have assumed that it was even inhabited by people. Everything after this goes uphill or downhill to various degrees, but mostly downhill. Take an issue like Aristotle's idea of the waters beyond the Pillars of Heracles. At the very least, he attributes a notable calmness and shallowness to them, and that's kind of it. As lame as that sounds, I don't want to downplay it too much either. Aristotle was Greek. He comes from a seafaring culture. He knows how troublesome and dissuasive that can be for naval travel. Still, though, this area that I expect he would want to avoid, he doesn't specify its extent, which means that it's kinda up for anybody's guess. For all we know, he could have thought that the waters remained like that until you got to the eastern coast, or maybe that they were just resigned to a comedically small and insignificant patch right around the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Could Aristotle also have just eaten up the Carthaginian and Greek stories about the Atlantic and come out thinking it was this foggy, mysterious, dangerous, monster-infested graveyard? Sure, maybe. Is there literally any evidence of that? No. Best case scenario, the dude just ate up every little bit of propaganda and every stupid thing that I've mentioned so far. Worst case scenario, the entrance to the Atlantic is still undesirably calm and shallow. I'll next tackle the issue of the distance across the Atlantic Ocean, because while yes, a larger ocean may indeed be more of an impediment to travel, in terms of optics, which is really all that matters at this point, a shorter but difficult to cross narrow Atlantic definitely looks more like a barrier in the proper sense. The kind of thing that you'd look at it and say that it prevents the Earth from being inhabited all around. Worst case scenario, the Atlantic basically becomes its own hemisphere. Best case scenario, it really does look more like a strip of water dividing his northern habitable zone. And lastly is our mud line. The one thing that at this point truly has a chance at making anything in this video actually sound like some second Great Barrier. When you think about things for like more than a moment, it almost immediately falls apart. Plato in both of his passages doesn't necessarily say that this mud is exclusively below water, but Aristotle just kinda does. I mean, he literally correlates the mud and the shallowness together. Hence, this cannot be some towering wall of Earth bisecting the planet, but it is still technically a stretch of terrain that impedes one sailing to the other hemisphere. Laugh at it all you want. Plato is still willing to call it impassable, and you know what, that's okay with me. Maybe it's not okay though, because this mud line, as I've taken to calling it, can fall to even more pathetic lows, as the extent to which the supposed mud spread out is specified by neither author. Worst case scenario, Aristotle might have imagined this mud as literally just some inconvenient blob sitting right outside the Mediterranean Sea. This, I think, is actually kind of unlikely, as again, regardless of the veracity of Plato's Atlantis story, or how seriously his student took it, Plato does actually describe Atlantis as quite big. Therefore, if Aristotle did at least take the mud part seriously, I imagine he may have assumed there to be quite an accumulation of it. So the best case scenario of this might be that Aristotle might have supposed that this barrier of mud may have actually occupied a respectable extent of the western coasts of Europe and Africa. While I actually lean more towards my optimistic estimate in this scenario, one could absolutely speculate in either direction and be justified. Really, whatever Aristotle actually believed in is probably somewhere in between, and probably closer to the worst case scenario, but maybe, just maybe, on top of believing that there was a massive zone of heat dividing humanity in twain, he may have also believed that there was a stretch of waters separating the eastern and westernmost parts of his world that could perhaps even be crossed, if not for the untraversable nature of the waters themselves, the restrictive calmness, the uncooperative shallows, and the ever-present tails of sea monsters, which might have actually have just been seaweed, and foremost of all, tell of a barrier of mud from his very own teacher. That is no red line, I'll admit, but it is a line, and in a world of regular people, over 2 millennia ago, that can divide the world in two just as much as anything, you know? Now for the things that I just have to completely wave the white flag on. The fact that his Earth is largely a world of continents, and that One Piece's blue planet is a world of islands. The fact that at best this mud line only covers like a quarter of an orthodrome. The fact that in some of these permutations, the northwest and southeast quarters of the world are nearly uninhabited, and probably a bunch of other issues. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to completely admit defeat on those. But listen, for a video with the premise of comparing Aristotelian geography and the world building of a form of media that he couldn't even comprehend made over 2 millennia later, I think I did alright. I wish polls were like still a thing that you could embed into YouTube videos, that way I could gauge people's opinions. But I guess I'll just ask, if I was able to convince you that Aristotelian geography resembles the One Piece planet, then you know what, please like the video, and if I fail to convince you, then that you should dislike the video. I can't wait to see this video's metrics. Either way, if this kind of stuff interests you, subscribe, I guess. I don't know what demographic this even appeals to, but I assume there's gotta be at least like one other person, 2 other people, I don't know. Either way, I've made my case, up for you to judge. Having played around with all of that nonsense throughout this video, I actually want to end this off on something a little more like meaningful, for lack of a better word. As I alluded to earlier, this video is kind of just a sub-project to something larger I hope to do one day. It has to do with the Antipodes, ancient geography, and a lot of other adjacent stuff. I did a lot of research into that already, and during that I found this one passage, and to me it just felt really cool to have the gift of being able to read it, and I'll do my best to narrate it to you. It comes from Jose de Acosta, a Jesuit missionary who lived from around 1540 to the year 1600. As I said earlier, the idea of a Torrid Zone persisted later than you think. Not to imply that it was still widely believed by this point, but it was still taken seriously by some. Its demystification really seems to have had a not so insignificant social impact, but I'll get into that if I ever make the sequel video. Besides that, De Acosta at some point seems to have, at least for a time, believed it. In 1589, he would publish his book, The Natural and Moral History of the Indies, which describes his encounter with this infamous Torrid Zone. Quote, "When I passed to the Indies, I will tell what chanced unto me. Having read what poets and philosophers write of the burning zone, I persuaded myself that coming to the equinoctial, I should not endure the violent heat, but it fell out otherwise. For when I passed, which was when the sun was there for zenith, being entered into Aries in the month of March, I felt so great cold, as I was forced to go into the sun to warm myself, What could I else do, then, but laugh at Aristotle's meteorology and his philosophy, seeing that in that place and at that season, when all should be scorched with heat, according to his rules, I and all my companions were a cold. In truth, there is no region in the world more pleasant and temperate than under the equinoctial, although it be not in all parts of an equal temperature, but have great diversities. End quote. And, well, I think I'll just end the video right there. I want to thank you for your time and attention. I hope that I was able to make it worth it. God bless, and bye. Alrighty, outro time. I know I usually ramble a lot during this part, but to be honest, I really don't have much I want to say. I just want to go ahead and get this video out soon, hopefully. Things are going good. This video is still going to be way longer than the video I wanted to make. This might be like over 40 minutes or something. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll make that sub 15-minute video. Who knows? This video topic was really stupid, but honestly I really enjoyed it. I feel grateful to have kind of like had this given to me. So, thanks be to God. And, okay, yeah, I guess that's it. Hope I can get another video out soon. I don't know when it will be or anything else really. I haven't even settled on another topic, so. Okay, alright, bye. God bless.